So welcome everybody to this second webinar of the Energy Community Secretariat. I hope now everybody can hear me properly and you can also see me apparently, at least in this small picture on the right, top right side. So Barbara, thanks also for the kind introduction. You mentioned already we are talking today about what we call REMIT, so the Regulation on Energy Market Integrity and Transparency. For introduction, my name is Nina Grall. I'm working here at the Energy Community Secretariat in Vienna, and I'm here together today with my colleague Arben Klokocci, who is an expert on electricity in the Energy Community Secretariat. But in his previous life, he also worked as a trader for a European trading company. So when we come later to our discussions and your questions and maybe topics that you want to be more in detail explained when it comes to experience on implementing the REMIT regulation in the European Union and best practice made there, then Arben will be best also here with you to answer your questions. Having said this, and having said that we will talk today about a REMIT, I should underline this is not meant, this webinar, to be a very general lecture, if you want, on the REMIT as such, but I would really like to talk today with you and explain to you what REMIT means for the energy community contracting party. So first of all, of course, we will have a look into the key content of the REMIT regulation, just to bring everybody on the same page what we are talking about. But then I would also like to explain to you what is the difference between REMIT in the European Union and REMIT in the energy community. Secondly, also, if there is a difference, why is there a difference? And finally, what are the obligations for the contracting parties in detail, and also where do they stand. At the end, and this is particular for the regulators and the market participants in this room, I would also like to share with you some examples how the implementation of REMIT could look like in the contracting parties, very practically, and share with you the templates that we are working on. We are trying to offer not only to the regulators, but then also later on for the market participants for implementation of the REMIT regulation. With this, I would like to first of all show how the Secretariat, and this is also in cooperation with the Energy Community Regulatory Board, tries to support the regulators in implementing the REMIT regulation, but then also give the market participants that are today with us in this virtual room, and I know there are a lot of them from what I know from the list of participants, to also give you a flavor of what might come on your agenda and what you might see soon on the website, or in which other any other format from your regulators that these requirements will be put on your agenda. Timing-wise, we have foreseen for the webinar roughly 30 minutes. My presentation will run for about 20 minutes, and afterwards we will go for a questions and answer session. Which would mean then roughly 10 minutes for this. But of course, if you would have a lot of questions, then Arben and I will also be flexible here. And if you want to stay longer with us, we will be happy to answer your questions. For the technicalities, I will not add anything more on top of what Barbara already told you. Just one practical information for you. As long as the slide presentation is running here on the screen, I cannot see your questions. So if we don't answer them immediately, please don't be surprised or even offended. We will come back to all your questions after the presentation. With this, I will directly go to the first slide and into my presentation. This is for today's agenda. I already mentioned, so the brief overview of what the idea of this webinar would be. So let us go directly to the first part, which are the key elements of the REMIT regulation. Again, a reminder here, this is not meant to be an in-depth lecture on the REMIT regulation, but just to bring everybody on the same page, on the same knowledge level. So let us recap what is in principle our target for the electricity and gas markets. We are, of course, heading for competitive gas and electricity markets, and we are aiming for secured supply via sufficiently available infrastructure. The question, what do we need for this? I think the main message that we should give here, and what would be the main answer to this question, we need trust in the market. If you want investments to happen and new market participants to enter the market, you have to give them a confident and stable regulatory and legal framework where they feel confident to take the economic risk that goes along with any investment or new market entrance. Okay, so how does REMIT contribute? We had this recap, what is our target and what is needed for this, and how now does REMIT contribute to all of these requirements. First of all, REMIT establishes an obligation to publish inside information. Secondly, it prohibits market abuse, which would then be either insider trading and or / market manipulation. REMIT also brings in a lot of new competences and important competences for energy regulators. First of all, there is an obligation for market participants, so these are those who are already active in trading, but also those who are planning to trade, to register with the regulator, and the regulator then also to collect data. I will show you a bit later, I mentioned this at the beginning, how this concretely could look like in the contracting parties based on the templates that we are currently working on. So how this registration would could look like for individual market participants, and also for you to see how this could then be implemented with the regulators. What is also new, at least to a certain extent new, are the investigatory and enforcement powers of regulators. All of you most probably know that regulators are stemming from the third energy package, at least in those contracting parties where it has been already transposed, and this is the case for all but one. Regulators already have penalty powers, and they also have investigatory powers. REMIT puts additional and stronger enforcement powers here. They are not contradictory to a third package, they only make the role of the regulators in penalizing and also in investigating stronger. Talking about all of this and having said this, I think what is clear and should come with all these new powers of regulators also is of course a clear requirement for data protection. So this was a brief wrap up on what the key elements of the REMIT regulation are. I will tell you a bit later, as I said, the practical implementation and how this could be concretely implemented in the contracting party. Coming to the second point of my agenda today, REMIT in the energy communities. What I told you so far is true for both the energy community and the European level. But is there now a difference between the REMIT regulation in the energy community contracting parties and the version applicable in the European Union? And if so, why is this the case? To give you a clear and straightforward answer, yes, there is a difference. What we have implemented in the energy community, or what our Ministerial Council, so our contracting parties have adopted, is what we call REMIT Light. So what does this mean? Essentially, it means we do not have central data collection by anybody, like on European level it's done by ACER. In the energy community, it could have been replaced by ECRB, but this has not taken place. So for the moment, we stopped actually, we deleted all provisions of the REMIT regulation, which are related to central data collection by ACER. I will tell you in a second why this is the case and what we would like to see or what we are hoping for in a second step. I have to, before I do that, I'll tell you that still on European level, even if there is a central data collection by ACER, the investigations are done by the national regulators. And there are several cases. I was just yesterday dropping over a very recent case where the British regulator fined companies for market manipulation for a quite high level. I think it was 37 million pounds, so a significant sum. And as I said, this is still the investigations, and the penalties are issued also on European level still by the national regulators. So difference, there is no difference between the contracting parties and the European level. Otherwise, we have replaced all provisions which relate to the function of ACER by ECRB, which, for example, relates to a central register. So I mentioned earlier companies active in trading or planning to be active in trading will have to register with the national regulator. But then at the same time, on European level, there is a requirement for ACER to establish a central register. And I will tell you of all European registered companies. I will show you a bit later how this looks for the European level and how it could similarly look for the energy community level. On the energy community level, this will have to be, this central register will have to be provided by the ECRB, which will most likely happen on the website of the energy community in a similar way that I will show you later for ACER, or for the first time maybe, or for the beginning maybe only making references to the national registers on the websites of the national regulators of the contracting parties. I promised to give you an answer why there is a difference between REMIT on European level and REMIT light in the contracting parties. First of all, it's a question of competences. So ACER has to be made competent, so be competent for non-European member states, which is essentially something where we would still need some adjustments in our treaty, and this is a process which is still ongoing. Secondly, it's, as in most cases, always about money. So it's also a question of budget that ACER would have to take responsibilities for additional contracting parties. So these are two elements that still have to be solved. Still, and this is the outlook that I would like to give you, we are still hoping for step 2. So for us, REMIT Light is not the end of the way. We are still hoping that at the end of planning, and this is on our agenda, to have ACER competent also for the contracting parties in terms of data, central data collection. However, this is also something which, as on European level, will certainly be linked to the progress we make with the implementation of the CSDM regulation. So once we are heading forward with this CSDM regulation adoption, then we might also go ahead with the second step of the REMIT regulation, which is so far pending. The third point, which I would like to discuss with you and to explain to you, which are the obligations for the contracting parties. So you saw now what the principal concept of the REMIT regulation is, how a light version looks for the energy community contracting parties. So what are now the concrete obligations for the contracting parties, which are the deadlines, and finally also the question, where do they stand now? We have adopted, the Ministerial Council of the Energy Community has adopted and adapted, as explained, version of the REMIT regulation in December 2018. This did not come out of the blue, as usually when we are negotiating new acquis, we did this in cooperation with our contracting parties, in this case the contracting party regulators, because they are most affected from the provisions of the REMIT regulation. And we also kindly had support from ACER and the European Commission. Why is this important? Because I mentioned already earlier that we are looking for the step 2, as I called it, so the full implementation of the REMIT regulation at a later stage. And there, of course, it's important to already from beginning on have consistency with what has been developed on European level and the experience that ACER has made. Transposition deadline, end of November 2019, so this already passed. Maybe for the European representatives in the room, in the virtual room, what does transposition mean for the contracting parties? This is a difference from what we have on European level. regulations have to be first transposed into national legislation, so they are not directly applicable. So this deadline passed already. Second deadline is the implementation deadline. This is still to come in May, so end of May this year. And I will show you now on the next slide where do we stand with this. Let's say we are halfway, or at least 1/3 way, let's put it this way. We have seen draft acts of the regulator. So in principle, it doesn't matter if the regulation is transposed by a primary act, so meaning and put into primary legislation, or if it's transposed by an act of the regulator. For the moment, we have only seen acts of regulators, so who were of the opinion or are of the opinion that they have at least to a certain extent sufficient powers to transpose the REMIT regulation into regulatory rules. And this is the case for Bosnia and Herzegovina, for Kosovo, and for Ukraine. We have reviewed these drafts, and from what we have seen is for Kosovo, we have to say to a very large extent, almost completely compliant. For Ukraine, we have a draft which is only transposing part of the REMIT regulation. The regulator also knows this, and actually what we need are law changes in order to implement provisions on penalties, on investigations, registration, and monitoring. So these are essentially a very important part of the REMIT regulation, so we cannot consider, of course, that for the moment the draft of the regulator of Ukraine is compliant. However, we are currently doing a technical assistance under EU for Energy program and initiative, which is governed by the Secretariat, in order to implement exactly these law changes, or at least propose them for Ukraine. For Bosnia and Herzegovina, similar situation. Regulators' draft is largely transposing the REMIT regulation. However, still the provisions on penalties are missing, and on investigations, plus it's only halfway to the extent that it only targets electricity. This is because the regulator, the state regulator of Bosnia and Herzegovina, does not have competences for the gas sector. We are expecting a draft regulatory act by the regulator of Georgia, so having changed or having in place now a new energy law. There is the assumption that the regulator can transpose and has sufficient powers to transpose REMIT regulation into a regulatory act. Otherwise, where we clearly see that law changes are needed, and this is then addressed, of course, to the ministries of the relevant contracting parties. I mentioned Bosnia and Herzegovina and Ukraine for the already mentioned provisions, and then it's also the case for Moldova, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia. Albania still comes with a question mark. There might be an option still to go for a regulatory act, but this is still to be further investigated. Finally, for the last point, before we come then to the questions and answer session, where I'm switching forward then to your contributions. How could implementation? I promised you at the beginning for certain elements that I referred to give you an example of European implementation practice, but then also how we would propose and try to support the regulators in implementing the individual parts of the REMIT regulation. As an overview, how would our support and how would our recommendations be developed? This would be a procedural act of the Energy Community Regulatory Board, which would somehow define the cooperation and coordination of national regulators under the REMIT regulation and provide some templates. And these templates would go for registration, for data collection and notification. There is one which draft which I will not show here now, but one template for ensuring data protection, which is about confidentiality, it's a non-disclosure agreement. And then what is very important, and I mentioned at the beginning, that we have replaced for everything else but for central data collection ACER by ECRB, which means also ECRB is the relevant body to coordinate investigations in case of a suspect of a breach of the REMIT regulation when it relates to cross-border activities. This is a very challenging new task of the ECRB. I will also show you now in a minute what our proposal would be, how this could be solved. It is more challenging, most evidently, for ECRB than for ACER, as ECRB is not a permanent body. So for registration, in principle, I mentioned already, the REMIT regulation requires market participants that perform an activity in the wholesale energy market to register, or are planning to do such an activity, to register with a regulator of the relevant contracting party. The national regulator then has to establish a national registry, and this is important to notice. This is not licensing. Some countries, for example, Ukraine, in the gas sector don't have, or also Montenegro don't have the requirement for licensing on the wholesale market. And this is important to mention. This is not meant to reintroduce licensing. This is a register with a national regulator. You will see in a second what the requirements would be. And then actually the national regulators would have to transfer to the ECRB this information about the registered persons. I have to underline also versus companies. I have to underline also here that what is transmitted to ECRB and what is collected on contracting party level does not necessarily have to be the same. So national regulators can require more information, which can go into telephone numbers or other email contacts of relevant company persons. This, of course, will not necessarily have to be published and then also not have to be sent to the ECRB. The ECRB, and this is mirroring what ACER is doing on the European level, then has to publish a central registry. As said, we will most probably do this on the, in a dedicated corner and on the website of the Energy Community Secretariat. This is the example. This is what you, if you open the website of ACER, this is the central registration format that the Agency for Cooperation of Energy Regulators have developed. So basically, if you go on the website, which I think is also taken from the website of Ofgem, if you go to the website of any regulator of the European Union, you will find a place where you can register. And this then links to a central registration template that has been developed by ACER. So this is in principle what we would also propose for the contracting parties. Also here the proposal is that every regulator publishes this template format on its website, and then companies would have to register here with a regulator, and then the regulator would deliver this information partly or completely to the ECRB, and this would be centrally published then by the ECRB. This is the excerpt what you see, and this could be also mirrored then for the contracting parties. This is what you have as a European register, then on the website of ACER, and then you can see here what you use is bluely marked European Register of Market Participants. If you click here, you have a list of all the registered market participants. Similarly, this could look like in the for the contracting parties, so on the website of the energy community. What we have been discussing for the beginning with the regulators is that maybe instead of having a central register, really listing all registered market participants, we would rather go for linking to the websites of the national registers until maybe at a certain time we have developed also some automatized update of these central lists. So basically, I would also like to mention one element that has been referred to in previous discussions when we have already discussed the REMIT regulation implementation with other stakeholders. Question was data collection. So how would the regulator know or get the information that there is maybe a breach of the REMIT regulation. And there are two very important points on that. One is, of course, regulators would have to use publicly available data, so be it in any newspapers or however this can be gathered. Second point, there is always the option of whistleblowers, and this is also how European experience started. And for this, we have also developed, and again here we have borrowed from the experience on European level, some kind of template for notification of potential breaches of the REMIT regulation to the regulators. Also, this is a template that, from our perspective, should then appear on the website of the individual regulators. We still have to discuss if this then maybe also goes centrally on the website of so the option to notify, not information as such. If this also goes centrally on the website of the Energy Community Secretariat, but in any case, there should be an option to notify national regulators in case somebody has a suspect of a breach of the REMIT regulation. So how would this look like? This is the template. I should say for this one, please don't take it 100% for granted. For the moment, it's still a document which is discussed among the regulators. And of course, we can and we don't want to force regulators to use it and not adjust it or adapt it if they think it's necessary to have some national adaptations. But at least this is to give you a flavor how it could look like. So in principle, it would say who is the reporting party, and then basically also describe what the potential or suspected breaches are. It will also have a more general box, if you want, where if somebody does not want to refer very clearly to this is a breach of Article 8 of REMIT regulation, maybe simply because he or she is not aware of this precise provision, where then he or she can also have a more general description of the suspected problems. And my last point before we come to the questions and answers, I mentioned the point of investigations. A challenging point, as I said, for ECRB, we are talking here not about national investigations, because national investigations are done by national regulators, as said, if they have the suspect of a breach of the REMIT regulation based on data collected or of notifications. So if they have this suspect on national basis, they will simply investigate here and take their national measures in a way, either to identify that there is no breach, or at the end to issue some penalties if necessary, as we have seen the cases already on European level, and I mentioned the very recent one of Ofgem at the beginning of this presentation. There is a second case foreseen in the REMIT regulation, which then relates to the case where a suspect of the breach of the REMIT regulation does not only relate to one contracting party, but then also potentially to another contracting party. So this would, of course, require some cooperation on cross-border level between the regulators, and this is, as I explained earlier, coordinated by the ECRB in the case of the contracting parties. So how would the process, and also this is not carved in stone yet, this is just to give you a flavor. The regulators are still discussing how the process can be done best. And I have to say this will be also at the end be learning by doing, because the same happened on European level, of course. Implementation of the REMIT regulation is a challenging process. And there might be even changes to this procedure as you see it here on this screen. But to briefly explain what the idea would be. So if one contracting party regulator has a suspect of a breach of the REMIT regulation in its contracting party or in another one that has effect or potentially has effect on a cross-border basis, this regulator would inform the ECRB section. ECRB section of the Secretariat, in this case, acting some kind of as a post office, if you want, for ECRB, but simply to deliver this information. We have prepared also a template for this so that the regulators don't have to invent any, I don't know, letter format or whatsoever. So there's a simple template proposal how the regulator would inform the ECRB section about its aspect. The ECRB section will forward the information immediately to the ECRB president, and then also to a working group, a REMIT working group that we have established under the ECRB already. And then the working group would have to agree on next steps. This can be done either within a physical meeting, or if there is no meeting planned, in any case within 3 weeks by a video conference or whatever format might fit. The next steps are nothing which are invented by the Secretariat or by ECRB or by the REMIT working group. They are actually enshrined, the options are enshrined already in the REMIT regulation. And those are either the next step is to take no action because the first considerations came to the conclusions that there is no breach of the REMIT regulation. Second one is to request the relevant regulators to provide more information. And the third one is then the president could come to the conclusion that yes, indeed, based on what the working group and the regulators found out so far, there is indeed a need to have a more in-depth investigation between the regulators that are concerned, so on cross-border basis. If this is the case, then investigatory group would be opened. Again, nothing different from what we know from European level. This is actually the practice of ACER as well. Important to underline that this investigatory group is not meant to take any decisions for the national regulators, but really to only coordinate their activities, to have a common approach for breaches of the potential breaches of the REMIT regulation to the extent they have or might have cross-border effects. At the end, what stands at this investigatory group activities is a report and the conclusion, what should be done next, whether there should be any further activities of the concerned regulatory authorities, or should there be any penalties, or maybe no, maybe there is indeed no breach of the REMIT regulation. So this is my final slide. Again, please keep in mind that the templates that I showed you are not yet necessarily 100% final. So don't prepare already for registration based on the slides that you saw now. But we hope to come up with at least before summer break with final templates, and then we hope to find them also on the websites of the regulators. This is also why we are discussing the templates and the procedures with the regulators, because they should fit them. It's not so necessarily that they have to fit for the Secretariat, but they have to be ready for national markets. But of course, the idea of coordinating this between regulators is also to have as much as possible unified approach.